Okay, we're going to finish up today by talking about not only how routine activities theory has been tested, but also where it is today and some potential criticisms that people have had about routine activities theory over the past couple years. So, for the most part, when Cohen and Felsen and other people have tested routine activities theory, they do so on a large scale. So we call that a macro level scale, using data from the aggregate, things like crime rates amongst cities or crime rates in specific regions of the country. Things like tracking the percentage of time women are out of the household and the percentage of households that get burglarized. Those kinds of things are what we would call macro level data. And for the most part, when you use that kind of data, you get a pretty strong amount of support for the theory. What I mean by that is, for the most part, the more amount of time women are out of the household, the higher the burglary rates. Or the smaller the average weight of a television, the higher the television theft rate. The idea here is that when you use macro level data, for the most part, routine activities theory looks like it is in some ways supported. For the most part, the largest amount of support for this theory comes from research on property crime, like burglary, as opposed to violent crime, like assault and murder. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of research that tries to support routine activities theory doesn't necessarily try to examine the rates of violent crime and how that might have to do with routine activities theory. But you can probably imagine some scenarios where someone's routine activities might heighten their risk of violent crime. For example, one thing that has been done and has found support is measuring the amount of time that young adults spend out at nighttime and comparing that to their victimization rates. For those kind of studies, routine activities theory also seems like it supports a connection with violent crime rates. More recently, though, the most interesting work on routine activities theory seems to be done looking at how our routine activities and our peer relationships might impact our victimization. So let's think about this for a second. How do our peers and the people that we hang out with on a daily basis influence our routine activities? Well, essentially, what researchers have identified as the major influence from peers is the fact that peers provide us with opportunities, specifically opportunities to commit crime. If you spend a lot of time with peers when you're hanging out in public areas or joyriding in cars, this gives you more opportunity from crime because you're not only coming into contact with more suitable targets, but peers also provide an audience and provide a low level of motivation, such as getting respect and status from your friends, that might be an important part of compelling someone to commit crime. And what people study in routine activities theory in relation to peers is how much unstructured activity time do you spend with peers, and does that correspond with how much deviance and crime you commit? And essentially what researchers have found is the more time that you spend with peers in an unstructured way, just hanging around someone's house, hanging around in the mall, joyriding, going to 7-Eleven, in my old very small hometown, going to the gas station, which we don't get into, but the point is the more time that you spend with peers not really doing much of anything, the more likely that you're going to get into trouble. And the idea behind that from a routine activities standpoint is you're creating more time and more opportunity for deviance because you're going to come in contact with more suitable targets who are not very capably guarded. So that's kind of an area where routine activities theory seems like it might be heading and has already started to get some research support. And as you can imagine, a potential policy suggestion coming out of this is if we just give youths more structured activities to do after school, they'll have less time for deviance and less time to get into trouble with their peers. Okay, so routine activities theory was developed originally by Cohen and Felsen in 1979. That was when their original paper was written. So when you think about where routine activities theory might be today, what we know about its development is really Felsen was the person who, Marcus Felsen was the person who really took the theory and continued to develop it into the 21st century. And essentially, what came out of his development was a book in 2002 called Crime and Everyday Life. Now, really, if you actually read through this book, which, if any of you are interested in this area, it's actually it's a very interesting thing to skim through and read a little bit, because he's designed this book as almost an instructional book for the average citizen on how to avoid victimization. So what he shows you is how different facets of your everyday life heighten your risk for victimization. It's really more of an instructional book on how to avoid opportunities for these things to converge than it is a book about theory. But that seems to be the direction that the theory is going, much more oriented toward the general public and oriented toward instructing and educating potential victims of crime. There have also been some interesting international studies trying to look at how Americans' routine activities might differ from the routine activities of people in other countries, and whether or not that has anything to do with delinquency. Now, the few studies that have been done on this have actually shown that, and we're looking for the most part at young adults and adolescents in these studies, what they found is, for the most part, American teenagers and adolescents have fairly similar routine activities to teens and adolescents in other countries. And for the most part, these comparisons have been done with European countries. In other words, teenagers in many European countries report similar levels of different kinds of routine activities as part of their daily life. We don't seem to hang out in an unstructured way any more than anyone else does. One of the interesting differences was in the country Hungary. The teens in that country reported spending a lot more time with their parents as opposed to spending time with teens in unstructured activities. And correspondingly, the kids in Hungary also had a much lower delinquency rate on average than not only the US but other European countries. So something that's been suggested is maybe the reason why teenagers and adolescents in Hungary have lower delinquency rates is they don't have as much opportunity. It's more culturally acceptable to spend a lot of time with your parents and family. So this is a new area. This is a growing area, and it's not necessarily something that anyone is ready to make any definitive remarks about, but it's definitely an interesting thing to think about, how our everyday life, our routine activities might really structure and play a big role in how much we get victimized. Another area that routine activities theorists are thinking about going into is how our routine activities on the internet might play into our risk of being victimized through cybercrime. So when you think about cybercrime activity, if you consistently, for example, visit unsafe websites, enter in personal information on websites that aren't guarded, enter your credit card information into an unsecure site. All of those things put you at higher and higher risk for your personal identification and information to be stolen and exploited. So one of the questions that people are asking is, if we alter the routine activities of people on the internet, can we make any difference in the level of cybercrime that's going on in the United States? Now, like all the theories that you're going to read about in this class and learn about in this class, routine activities theory has its share of criticisms as well, and not everyone agrees that the ideas in routine activities theory are necessarily the best explanations for most criminal activity. Probably the biggest criticism, and the one that routine activities theory is least able to solve, is the lack of care or interest in trying to explain criminal motivation. If you remember back to when I was first describing routine activities theory, I told you that Cohen and Felsen didn't think that motivated offenders were something that needed a lot of explanation. The motivation to commit crime to get what you want or make you happy or get status or respect for them just wasn't that interesting of a thing to explain. For the most part, there are always going to be people, according to them, who are somewhat motivated to commit crime. And it's up to us as potential victims to alter situational factors to make the decision to commit crime less likely. Now, that's not something that a lot of criminologists find to be very satisfying, because as we go forward in this semester, you'll see that explaining the motivation to commit crime is a pivotal part of most theories of crime. It's what most people are interested in, explaining what motivates some people to commit crime and some people not to. And it's not something that routine activities theorists spend a lot of time on. So that's a big criticism of the theory. Another criticism of the theory is these concepts that Cohen and Felsen identified as suitable targets and capable guardians. Now, if you've been wondering throughout this lecture, what the heck is a suitable target? What does it mean to be capably guarding something? If you're wondering exactly how one defines those, you're not wrong. Those are very vague concepts, and in the original paper, the wording of how they are originally described in the paper is also very vague. And Cohen and Felsen would tell you that they did that on purpose, so that their theory could be applied to a lot of different types of crime, a lot of different types of targets. But in the end, it makes the theory very difficult for other people to take and then measure. How do you decide whether something is being guarded or not? What makes something suitable to be victimized for violent crime as opposed to property crime? So, again, these things are fairly vague. It makes a reading of the theory a subjective experience, and a lot of times people have trouble testing the theory because they won't necessarily define suitable targets and capable guardians the same way that other people would. So that's another criticism of the theory. And another criticism of the theory is the fact that routine activities theory just isn't as good at explaining violent crime as it is property crime. So it makes a lot more sense to go through the progression of how property and material items have evolved and changed over time and explain that evolution as having something to do with its level of getting stolen. That makes sense to a lot of people. So routine activities theory is pretty good at explaining property crime. It's not so good at explaining violent crime and particular types of violent crime like intimate partner violence. You think about intimate partner violence, spousal abuse. That actually is one of the hardest things for routine activities theory to explain, because for the most part, when we're talking about intimate partner violence, we're talking about women being victimized by their spouse, their significant other in their home. Well, according to routine activities theory, a woman in her home should be at the lowest risk of getting victimized for crime. But obviously, this is an example of a crime that just doesn't seem to fit very well with the concepts in routine activities theory. So that's a criticism of the theory because it seems like it can explain some crimes better than others. And finally, one of the trickiest criticisms to understand is this idea that the opportunities to commit crime are things which are dependent on this convergence of motivated offenders, suitable targets, and capable guardians. Not everyone agrees that you necessarily need all of those things for crime to occur, because realistically, all of you experience and encounter potential opportunities to commit crime every day. In other words, think about what it took for you to get into the classroom the last time that we met. You probably had to drive to the class or walk through campus. So think about what prevented you from running red lights and stealing someone's bicycle along the way. It was there, it wasn't necessarily being guarded very well. The idea here is people are confronted with potential opportunities to steal, rob, hit people all the time. It can't just be about these three things converging. So this gets back to this idea of motivation. If opportunities to commit crime are pretty ubiquitous in our lives, they happen all the time, in other words, there must be something that motivates some people to utilize those opportunities and something that causes some people to not take advantage of those opportunities. So one thing that routine activities theory doesn't do very well is have an explanation for why, in terms of amount of time during a day and amount of time in a person's life, they actually commit very few crimes. Even the most serious frequent offenders, when you think about it, really only commit, 1 or 2 crimes a week, a few a month. There's a lot of other time in their lives that they're not committing crime. So routine activities theory doesn't have a great explanation for why so much of people's lives is not taking advantage of these opportunities. I asked you all to read Chapter 2 of the Paul Cromwell book, which is the chapter describing, it's got real life quotes from burglars describing things like their motivations to commit the crimes that they did, decisions to pick specific targets. So think back for a few minutes to some of the motivations that were given by the burglars in this study. For the most part, what these burglars talked about in the Cromwell book was the fact that money to buy drugs and alcohol, or fulfilling the expensive needs of a fast lifestyle, were some of the most important reasons the people gave to why they were committing crime and why they were burglarizing houses. So, in other words, not a lot of people stated that they were burglarizing because they had to pay rent or burglarizing so that they could feed their family. For the most part, the motivations that people gave were more self-serving and not necessarily to get things that they need, but to get things that they want. Another thing that was interesting about the description in the book were the fact that a lot of the burglars described their main motivation to burglarize as the fact that they liked the excitement of it. They liked the rush and the thrill, and that was motivation enough to commit the crime. So even though that was usually not the primary motive they stated, it tended to show up a lot in the text of the reasons that they gave to why they committed the crime. Another interesting part of the Cromwell book was the burglars' descriptions of how they decided to pick specific targets. So how they decided to pick one house as opposed to another. And what I want you to get to see as you read through this chapter is the idea of carefully planning and casing specific places to burglarize didn't really seem to happen as much as you might think from other cultural representations of burglaries. For the most part, burglaries seem to be products more of opportunity than purposeful selection. If a burglar happened upon a house that seemed like it was unguarded, if he happened upon property that seemed like it was momentarily easy to take, that factored a lot more into the decision than days or weeks worth of planning and casing houses and discovering security systems. In other words, the burglars, your typical burglar, doesn't seem to go through a very sophisticated stage of planning their attack. Think about, in the reading, whether or not the burglars in the study tended to focus more on short-term consequences or long-term goals when they were describing what was going through their minds while they were committing their crime. For the most part, what I found in a reading of this chapter was that most of the offenders really only focused on the short-term consequences. In other words, they burglarized something, and the only thing that was really in their mind was what they were going to get out of it immediately, not the long-term potential consequences of getting punished or put in jail. So the idea that a burglar, your typical burglar, really carefully weighs the pros and cons of committing an act doesn't seem to happen in quite the long-term, drawn-out process that things like rational choice theory or routine activities theory would have you think. And for the most part, the decisions that your typical burglar makes are hurried and focused on short-term goals. And another thing that I thought was especially interesting in the Cromwell chapter was their description of how they assessed potential risks present in a house before they burglarized it. So some of the things that the burglars mentioned for being potential risks were things like only wanting to burglarize in a neighborhood where they would fit in. In other words, if they were an African American male, only walking around and looking for potential burglary sites in neighborhoods that were predominantly African American, so that they wouldn't stand out. That's one thing that they cited as being an important risk. Others stated that very affluent neighborhoods have too high a risk of getting caught, so they just avoided them altogether. So even though, as you can imagine, they would be able to benefit much more from one individual affluent house, they tended to avoid those because they had the sense that the risk was too high. Another thing that I thought was interesting was The biggest deterrent, the one that they cited the most often as being the biggest deterrent to burglarizing a house, was the presence of a dog. So whether or not there was a dog that could potentially bark and disrupt their burglary, that played a big role in whether or not they burglarized. And I thought that was a really interesting finding because not a lot of people would think of that as being the key deterrent. Most of you would probably think more to knowledge of whether or not there was a security system or people present in the house. But the most burglars said was, no, it's a dog barking and alerting not only the victims but the neighbors that actually causes them the most worry. So I thought that was a really interesting part of the chapter, and I really encourage you, if you haven't thoroughly read it yet, to go back and really read through their descriptions because it provides an interesting glimpse into the lives of the people who most often get arrested for this kind of crime. And one thing you can think about is the fact that these are burglars who have gotten caught, gotten arrested. So an interesting question, which we probably will never really fully be able to answer, is, are these people different than burglars who are more skillful and avoid detection? But that's obviously a question that is very hard for criminologists to try and answer. Okay, so that's the end of today's lecture. Next time we're going to talk about the entire theoretical area that is positivism and introduce you to some biological theories of crime. Don't forget to do your Hagen reading, which is only part of Chapter 5 in your big textbook. And we're also going to have a discussion in class about the discussion reading, which is posted on Blackboard under Discussion Readings. And the title of that article, which is a very short little 2-paragraph article, I think it's actually just a table, and it's called Defenses Sometimes Attempted by Lawyers. So just want you to look through it and see some of the different types of defenses that have been used to try to justify and explain criminal behavior, because that will tie in well to our biological theory discussion. Okay, I will see you on Thursday.